Soil. So nature does not like bare soil. And if you don't cover it either with mulch or with living plants, nature will cover it for you, most likely with some sort of weed. So in order to keep your weed problems down, you would want to cover that soil. And then to extend your harvest as late as possible. Keep the grocery store trips to a minimum as long as you possibly can, and keep that fresh produce coming in from your garden as long as you possibly can, right up until the frost and even well beyond the frost. Now, when should late season veggies be planted? Well, the first thing you need to do is to determine what the first frost date is for our area. Um, Frost dates are not a hard and fast thing. They obviously aren't the same every year. And so when you look it up online, you're going to get a range of dates. And it's sort of based on percentages. It's like the chance of it being the 1st of October is such and such, and the chance of it being the 7th of October is so and so. So what I've done here is just given a range of the fact that it's typically somewhere between October 1 and October 15. And because I like to err on the side of caution, I'm going to make an assumption in this case that our first frost is going to come closer to October 1st, and we're going to kind of work off of that. If it comes later than that, that's just a bonus. You're going to get more harvest from what you've planted. So that's a good thing. But if you were to plant it the opposite way, you might not get a harvest at all. So we're going to go off an October 1st date. Then what you want to do is look at the days to maturity for the plant varieties that you're considering planting. For our purposes here, I figured that because today is July 18th, we've got 74 growing days till October 1st. That's quite a few. And so anything that has a days to maturity of, say, 60 to 65 days, you should be in a good window for that. And there are lots of things that have that kind of a day to maturity. So look at the packaging of your seeds and make sure you know what the days to maturity is before you plant anything in the fall. And then also consider whether what you're wanting to plant is frost tolerant or not. And I'm going to get a little bit more into that in the upcoming slide. So 2 general categories of vegetables to consider planting at this time. First are vegetables that are heat loving and are sensitive to frost. These are vegetables that will die with the first frost. Those would include the categories of summer squash, beans, and cucumbers. These are all things that would be suitable to plant in the heat of summer. And there are varieties that have short enough days to maturity to mature before that first frost. When it comes to beans, we would recommend a bush type bean. They tend to mature sooner than a pole bean. And also when it comes to cucumbers, look at pickling varieties versus more of your standard slicing cucumbers or even those real long slicers. The pickling cucumbers obviously are ready to be picked when they're very small, and you're going to get a much bigger harvest. Then the second category of things to consider would be things that are frost tolerant. So these are a few examples, not all the examples by any means, but these are a few things you could consider. Here I've listed brassicas, and if you're not familiar with that term, that just refers to a family of plants of which many are grown as vegetables. So that includes things like cabbage, Brussels sprouts, rutabagas, kohlrabi.
Cauliflower, kale.
Yep, there's lots and lots and lots of them. Typically, you could plant these out now, but you would have wanted to start them indoors earlier. The exception to that would be things like collards and kales, things that you could eat as immature plants. You could eat the baby leaves off of those. So those would be something to consider. And then both types of radishes, both the spring and the winter varieties, Winter radishes are really meant to be planted at this time of year. And you can see two examples here on the screen of different winter radishes that I've grown at my house. So they're a lot of fun. A lot of different things than you're used to from spring radishes.
Heidi, can I jump in for a moment?
Absolutely.
Just to clarify a little bit about what frost sensitive means. At 32 degrees, which is considered frost, some things die instantly. That would be beans, tomatoes, basil, that type of crop. Other of these crops under the frost tolerant can survive the upper 20s, even down to the lower 20s. So especially your kales, your cabbages, parsley will almost make it through the winter. It's amazing what they can tolerate. So be aware of that as well.
Right. Thank you. Now, this is a guideline, and this chart here does not in any way represent every kind of vegetable that you might be able to plant in the fall, but it is going to cover a lot of the main categories. And what I've done here is trying to create a graphic that would give you a good idea of when certain things should be planted. So above the blue bar are things that are not frost tolerant, as Beth was just saying, those things that are going to be killed by that first frost. And so as you can see by looking at the green squares on the chart, basically we're suggesting those be planted in the next 2 weeks by the end of July, or with cilantro, you might be able to push it a little bit further than that. But you want to get those in the ground pretty quickly. What I've done here also is listed what the days to maturity can be, depending on which variety you choose. And then I've added 7 days or a week to each of those. And the reason I'm doing that is because as the days get shorter in the fall, you're getting less and less sunlight to your plant, and the temperatures are going to be cooling. Their days to maturity are not going to be as true as they would be if they were planted in the spring. So in the fall, we want to take the days to maturity and actually add extra days on to give us a better idea of when those crops are going to be ready. So you look at the total days is maybe what you would more expect for a mature plant and to be able to harvest. Down
And
below,
another thing, can I add, Heidi?
yeah,
Things like cucumber, the zucchini, even the beans, they may have enough days to get to maturity, but they're really susceptible to mildews and other types of foliar diseases, which may end up disappointing you as you plant them. I mean, who knows how this fall is going to play out, but just be aware of that. That Heidi is um, perfectly correct in saying, the sooner you get those in the ground, the better.
and as with any gardening, springtime as well, your soil fertility, the weather, which you have no control over, are all going to be factors in how well your crops do. So there's certainly no guarantees that if you follow this chart, you're going to end up with bumper crops. Gardening is all about learning and experimenting. And I certainly hope that if you do try some of these things this fall and it doesn't turn out as well as you had hoped, that you'll evaluate and then, try again next year with maybe a different variety, a different spot in your garden, that kind of thing. It's all about learning from the garden and then trying something new. So just down below that blue line are the items that would be frost tolerant, and again, their days to maturity. And you can see that we're suggesting those could be planted later. Some of these items actually don't like the heat, so they would prefer to be planted a little bit later in the summer rather than right now to avoid the worst of the heat. And you might also want to consider, whether you can rig up some type of shade on hot days, whether that's with a roll cover or some other kind of mechanism to trellis or something that might provide a little shade as these crops that don't like intense heat are getting started.
And
Anything
the
else?
other thing is, whoops.
Yeah. Go ahead.
The other thing is some crops, like many of the kales and the turnips and perhaps the chard, taste better after they've been exposed to a frost. So there's a whole family of kales that are much better planted later in the season rather than first thing in the spring.
Yeah, excellent, excellent point. When you're choosing what to plant, and some of you may have seeds at home right now that you want to use, or you may be interested in trying to acquire some seeds for this purpose. I actually placed an order very recently for a few things that I want to grow this fall, ordered from a company called High Mowing, and got my seeds very, very quickly. So ordering online is definitely still a possibility. So if you want to look for varieties that would do really well, consider a couple things here, like consider plants that can be harvested at different stages. Beets, for example, you can harvest greens when the beets are still immature. Certainly don't want to take all the greens, but you could take some of the greens and eat those while you're waiting for the roots to mature. So you're getting two crops there. Things like lettuce and kale and spinach and pretty much most greens can be harvested as baby greens and then, as adult greens. Look for varieties that have the shorter growing season. So if you go to a site and they've got 10 different varieties of cucumbers, even 10 different varieties of pickling cucumbers, perhaps, I would still look through those to see what their days to maturity are. So there's a variety called Bushy that has very short vines and has a days to maturity of 45 to 50 days versus this Longfellow cucumber that is more like, 62 to 80. So the Bushy would obviously be better for this purpose. Also, peas are great in cool weather, but I would suggest looking for pea pods like snow peas or snap peas rather than peas that you would grow for the actual mature peas because those are going to take a lot longer to mature. Same with squash. Again, look for varieties that have the shortest days to maturity so that you can get as many ripe fruit to harvest as possible. And then you can also do some research on, which, even in the kales, which kale seems to be the most cold hardy. They do have a lot of information online about lettuces and kales and other greens that have better cold tolerance than others. You can look into that. Beth, anything to add on that? Okay.
You're doing great.
Like I said, trial and error is really one of the best ways of determining what works best in your garden, in your soil conditions, in your sunlight conditions, all those kinds of things.
And Heidi, I noticed that there was a note about covering crops helps you get a few more days, weeks, whatever. There are special types of cover crops, row covers they're called, that are kind of a spun fabric that help hold in the heat,
Yes.
or in the summertime, guard your plants from insects and other kinds of airborne diseases. And I think that's going to kind of become the wave of the future here in Minnesota as we find more and more pests moving into our region and with uncertain frosts and snows, whatever, at the very last minute. So you can go to any major garden supplier and look for row covers.
Right. And if you're really ambitious, you could build, hoop covers for beds as well. If you want to get real serious about being able to extend your harvest with starting some kales or carrots or things like that now, and then covering them with a hoop house, essentially a small hoop house to extend your harvest well into like November. So there's lots of ways of doing that as well. As far as seeds still at the seed library, there are some that would work for fall planting. We, just to give you a little bit of an update on how well the seed library did this season, we had almost 12,000 seed packets checked out from the seed library, and there are only about 1,500 packets left. So it was tremendously successful and popular this year, and huge thank you to the staff at the Rochester Public Library for being willing to mail seeds out. And at this point, they are using their pickup like they do with books. You can reserve seeds at the seed library and then pick them up by driving up too. So you can get those very quickly. And some of the seeds that are still in stock that would work for the fall would be a bunch of different kinds of leafy greens. So we've got kales, we've got leaf lettuce, bok choy, mizuna, and mustard greens are all available at the seed library. There are still some French breakfast radish seeds and also an herb called epazote, which I don't know if it will grow all the way to seed at this point. Normally, it is a very heavy self-sower. It goes to seed and then, kind of comes up all over the place the next year. So perhaps this is a good time to plant it if you avoid it's weeding all over your garden. I'm not sure how that would work, but yeah, so check out the seed library. And there are other varieties as well that we would not necessarily recommend for fall planting, but you could get them now for next year as well.
And Heidi, those leafy greens are among the most hardy, can survive the coolest temperatures. So that's really a plus.
Yes, and very nutritious as well. All right, so what do you want to do to prep your site? Well, you want to remove any weeds and the remnants of the spring crops, and then really thoroughly amend your soil with some good compost. And consider if you need to add any nutrients to your bed. Compost is full of nutrients in itself, but if what you had in there was a real heavy feeder, you may want to add some nutrients to the soil and plant your seeds. And then what we would suggest that you mulch them well. You want to keep the soil cool as those seeds are sprouting and moist as well. Water frequently and deeply during those first few weeks when the weather is really hot. Just like in the spring, you need to keep your seeds well watered and mulched while they are getting themselves established. It's really no different in summer than it is in the spring, but really baby them a little bit to get them through the heat.
Heidi, can I add something?
Yes.
If you're planting the root crops, turnips, radishes, whatever, don't be careful about adding too much nitrogen because you'll get a lot of leaf, but not very much root.
Right.
And a general guideline for making sure your seeds are moist enough is an inch of rainfall a week. 2 inches is even better, but at least an inch.
Okay, thank you. So this is not, can you guys still see my screen?
No.
No, okay. I don't know what happened. Let me reshare. Yeah, something went kind of haywire. I will reshare. Hold on.
Yay.
Can you see that now?
Yes.
So a great crop to plant in the fall is garlic. And this is not something that we provide at the seed library because generally people don't grow garlic from seed. They grow it from cloves. So you would have to acquire some garlic either online or purchase it locally from a farmer or at the farmer's market or something. But garlic is actually planted in October. So you have plenty of time to plan and plant garlic this year. It's just a super fun crop to grow. It's very, very easy. It's just very rewarding. So I would highly recommend planting garlic. So garlic actually comes in two general categories. You've got soft neck and hard neck garlic. Soft neck garlic is the kind that you typically buy in the grocery store, and it's generally less cold tolerant than hard neck. I have only grown hard neck myself, so I don't have any experience with the soft neck. There may be varieties that would do fine here. I can't necessarily advise on a specific one, but the hard neck does very, very well. There are many, many, many interesting varieties of garlic. They come in different colors, sizes, flavors. So it's fun to try a few different ones. Lots of companies sell them, but I would definitely go online and look now because it's possible they could be starting to sell out. You would just prepare your soil by loosening it and adding compost as you would for planting anything else. You would break apart the bulbs of garlic into the individual garlic cloves and just be really careful to keep all those papery layers intact. And then you would plant each clove with the pointed end up about 4 to 6 inches apart and about 3 inches deep. And then on top of the soil, you're going to want to mulch with a good heavy mulch. I would say about 3 inches. I've used fall leaves. I've used straw mulch before. Both of them have worked just fine. And then you'll just leave it. And in the spring, it will just start poking through the mulch and will grow until it is harvested in the first half of July. So a really easy crop, and you can grow, well, at least for me, I grew in half of one of my raised beds, which would have been an area of 2 feet by 8 feet, so 16 square feet. And more than enough garlic to last me for an entire year and have enough to plant, out again too. So super fun. Anything to add on garlic, Beth?
No.
All right, with that, I am going to turn it over to Beth to talk about some other interesting things to plant in the fall.
Okay. As mentioned in the introduction, I do a demonstration garden out at the History Center that is all heirloom. And this year, due to COVID, we were shut out of the garden. They didn't want anyone out in public, any of the master gardeners working with the public just because of the danger of spreading. And by late June, the weeds in the field in the garden were 3 feet high. And we were able to obtain an exemption because the public garden, a demonstration garden, it in the past has applied food to challenges. So my thought was we could go in and put down plastic, black plastic, to keep further weeds from sprouting so it would be ready for the next year. Well, one of my concerns, Ethan Swanson, suggested, what about a cover crop? And I thought, okay, why not experiment? I've always thought of cover crops as something that farmers plant in order to enrich their soil or take care of rotation concerns, or that sort of thing. But as it happens, I started reading up on cover crops for the home gardener and realized I've been missing some really important ways to make my garden healthier. As Heidi sort of covered earlier, when you have bare soil and you walk on it, for one thing, that compacts the soil. It pushes all those little particles that make the soil closer together, and It stops water and nutrients from getting down to the roots where the plants really need them. It also can lead to erosion. Rochester, this whole region is now subject to more torrential kinds of rains, the 3 to 5 inch rainfalls that just beat the soil. And it can also create kind of a hard crust on the soil that kind of slows down germination. And depending on what you plant, cover crops can actually look around in the soil and they can capture nitrogen and other really important uh, elements that help your plant grow. Um, it also, talking again, most of the soil in Rochester is clay soil that is subject to compaction. And these cover crops, depending on which one you choose, can send those roots way down into the soil and push apart all those particles so water comes through better and nutrients are more available. And oh, I forgot my point there, but they can also, if you harvest those cover crops or cut them down before they go to seed, they become reservoirs for all that plant has brought up into the plant structure. And especially if you compost those before bringing them back to your garden, you get a really balanced sort of nutrient source. It also, cover crops can prevent soil diseases and pests if you have bare ground and some of that tomato blight is floating around. If you have something there rather than bare ground, it doesn't make its way into the soil. And also there's a bonus depending on when in the cycle you plant the different types of cover crops, you can help butterflies and other sorts of beneficial insects. So do you want to add anything, Heidi? Oh, I've lost your volume.
Oh, I was muted.
Oh.
All right.
As I said, I'm just beginning to learn about how to use these, but in the reading that I've done, I've realized that this is really so important to making a healthier and a more productive gardens. And in the last 2 slides, I get some resources for where you might look. Good seed sources. One thing I know this year is that people have been ordering seeds like never before for obvious reasons, but most of these seed companies still have a pretty good supply. I would also say that reading seed catalogs and looking at all the articles that are on these sites is one of the best ways to learn. I mean, I'm amazed at how much I have learned just by reading seed catalogs. The last source there, the pine tree seed. The reason I list that one is not only do they have superior seeds that germinate really well, but they also have smaller packets, which are really good for the home gardener. And then if you're looking specifically for more information on vegetables for fall harvest, I really recommend you start with University of Extension sites. Most land-grant universities have a mission, which is to educate and provide information. So the information you find, for instance, at the University of Minnesota Extension site or Wisconsin, which just happened to be in our same regional category, that's vetted information. That's not what someone's uncle told you or you learned from your next door neighbor. This is solid information that has been proven through research. So there are a variety of articles to take a look at there. And then Heidi, the next slide. Information on cover crops. And the extension sites are meant to educate your home gardener. I mean, they're not intended to be college level courses. So they're really digestible, easy to use information. For information on cover crops, Johnny Selected Seed, which is in Maine. They are the premier site. There is more information there than you could possibly imagine. So I really do recommend taking some time to look through these sites. You'll be amazed at what you can find and learn. So anything else, Heidi?
No, you've got an excellent list there. Thank you. I'll be looking at that myself.